Welcome, welcome everybody. It's time to get started. It's very nice to see so many people interested in the topic of demand forecasting. I'm happy that you're here. Thank you for that. So my name is Michał Kaczmarek, and I'm a software engineer that is responsible for the master planning, resource scheduling, and also for the demand forecasting that I'm here to talk about. So today we're going to talk about the topic of how to extend the existing demand forecasting solution that has been released in IX 2012 R3 to better meet your needs, the needs of your customers. So we'll start from the short introduction where I'll tell you a little bit about the feature description so you know what we are talking about. Then we'll go through the high-level design so you can understand better how the solution really works in the design level, so you know where to go in order to extend the existing functionality. I'll also talk a little bit about different Microsoft SQL Server editions, because the demand forecasting will behave differently depending on the edition of the SQL Server that you have in your environment. After that, I'll talk about the security setup, about how to set up the different services that are used to generate the baseline forecast, and then also how to grant the full and limited access to the data that the users see in Excel. So how to limit the data that is visible in the Excel. And I'll do the demo how to do both the setup of the services and also how to set up the roles for the different users within your organization. The next part will be about the functionality extensions. So we'll talk about how to modify the existing functionality that we have, more precisely about how to add a new forecasting dimension, and also how to add a new measure that you can see also in the Excel. And the demo will be about how to add a new sales responsible dimension that we don't have in the basic demand forecasting solution into our system. The last part will be about the data source extensions. So how you can load the data from the external systems, from the other system that Dynamics IX 2012 R3, and generate the forecast based on this external data. And the demo will be about how to get the data from IX 2009 and generate the forecast in the IX 2012. So let's start with the short introduction and the overall feature description, so you know what demand forecasting is about. So overall, demand forecasting feature is a functionality that predicts the demand based on the historical data that you have in your system. So basically, there is an engine that analyzes the historical data. It learns how the data looks like, and then it generates the predictions for the future. To achieve that, we have used SQL analysis services. That is like the brain of the whole solution. And we have used the time series algorithms that are provided within the analysis services. Then when the forecast is generated, it is basically visualized and can be adjusted in the Excel. So the final user can adjust the predictions that have been generated by the analysis services. And when all those users are done adjusting their forecast, it is simply imported back into AX. So it can be further used to run MRP and to fulfill this future demand. So how does the data flow within demand forecasting? So here you have the basic diagram explaining the different processes. You see those circles here, the different processes, and also the different tables, like you can see within those lines. So you have the processes and the tables here, and also different parts of SSAS, like you see here. So the whole story starts from the historical transactions. So we need historical transactions in order to generate the forecast. So how is it done in the demand forecasting? We basically look into the invent trans tables, both invent trans and invent trans origin, that are the tables that most of you probably know who has been working in IX. It's the tables where all the inventory transactions are stored, for example, the sales order, the purchase order, or all the transfers. So basically we have all the inventory history there. So this data is read into the cube staging table. And this is the table that is the part of the demand forecasting solution. So basically the part of the inventory transactions are read into the cube staging table. After this is done, the data is further enriched. So in the demand forecasting, we can enable or disable different forecasting dimensions. And based on those dimensions that you have enabled, they are further filled into this cube staging table. If the dimension is not enabled, it will not be a part of this enrichment process. If you have enabled the dimension, the cube staging table will be filled within this dimension. To get the data to this dimension, we are reading other data sources. So for example, if you have enabled the customer and customer group dimension, the specific processor will run and read the data from this customer and customer group table and put it into the staging table. Also in this place, it is worth mentioning that you can also read the data from the external data sources. And this data should be put into the cube staging table so it can be further processed by this process. So we have the basic historical transactions with all the specific dimensions filled, and we aggregate those transactions by dates, by the different date buckets that you have set in the form that you use to run demand forecasting. So, for example, if you decided to generate forecast by weeks or by months, the data will be grouped by weeks or by months and put into the mining model staging table based on these settings. Also, the data is grouped by the dimensions that you have enabled. So the aggregated data is put into the mining model staging table. And this is the table that is read by the mining model, by the analysis services mining model. And the mining model, as I said before, it's like the brain of entire solution. So it basically gets the data from this mining model staging table, and it analyzes that. It tries to find correlations between the data, and also it tries to find, the forecast based on the historical data. So when processing of the mining model is done and the mining model has learned how the data looks like, we can import the predictions that have been generated within the mining model. And all those predictions, so the future forecast, is put into the RegDemPlan forecast table. So basically, you have like the historical data in the cube staging table and the predictions in the forecast table. And those two data sources are used to process the SSAS cube. And basically, the SSAS cube is the multidimensional database that stores both the historical transactions, so you can see them in Excel, and also the future forecast. So the cube is processed, and all the data from the Dynamics database is simply read into the cube, and it stays there. So when we have all the data read into the cube, it can be accessed through Excel. So the Excel, it's like the client for the analysis services. It doesn't hold the data. It doesn't hold the forecast or the historical transactions. It just reads them from the cube, and if the user wants to adjust the forecast, he simply modifies it in Excel, and he needs to publish it back to the SSAS So the data is persisted and can be further imported back into AX. So another process is run in order to read the data from the SSAS cube and put it back into AX Word so it can be further used by MRP. So overall, the story is like that. The historical transactions from the InventTrans are read into the staging table. They are aggregated, then put into the mining model. So then the mining model can generate the predictions, and both the historical data and the predictions are put into the cube so the users can access this data through Excel and adjust the forecast according to their needs and what they think the forecast should look like based on their knowledge. So how does the system behave based on the different versions of Microsoft SQL Server? So basically, if you buy the standard edition of the Microsoft SQL Server, you will get a single mining model per mining structure. This means that all the historical data will be basically put into one mining model. So the correlations between the data will be found among all the historical data. What's next? You will get the basic set of parameters that you can use to manipulate how the forecast is generated. So based on those parameters, you can change either the time series algorithm that you want to use or some other different parameters there. And if you want to write your own algorithm that will generate the forecast, and you have the standard edition, you can do it in X++. You can write your own algorithm, but in X++. If you have the Enterprise edition, you have many more options. It's much more powerful. So, for example, in the Enterprise edition, you have the several mining models per mining structure. This means that each allocation key that you have defined in your system with the items, the allocation key is grouping the items in the system, is put into the separate mining model. This means that the mining model can find better correlations between the data, and if you set it up correctly, like put the items that behaved differently, like the demand of it was like similar. For example, the periodicity of the data was similar, you will get more accurate forecast. And also, it's very good to know that when you have multiple mining models, they can be processed concurrently. So the whole process can run faster because you can use like the concurrent execution and processing of the mining models. If you have the Enterprise edition, you also get the full set of parameters for the time series. And if you really want to, you can also write your own algorithm for the analysis services. If you want to have like the best of both worlds, you can buy the SQL Server BI edition. That is like the standard edition, but it has all the features of BI that you will get into the Enterprise edition. So you have like the functional parity regarding the BI features with the Enterprise edition if you buy the BI edition. And if you want the comparison, I have given the link here so you can compare different versions. So how to set the security? So we have worked with some customers that had problems setting up the security of demand forecasting correctly, to set up the services correctly, and we've been trying to help them out. And this is because we would like to share this knowledge about how to set up your system so everything is secure, and that you can also limit the access to the data that is visible in Excel based on the different users that adjust the forecast in your organization. So let's start with some explanation about the services. that are used for generating the demand forecast. So basically, you have three main services that are used to generate the forecast. The basic one is the AOS, Application Object Service, which runs the entire process in AX. We have also the SQL, which is the database that stores all the data that you have in your AX, and also the SSAS, the Analysis Services. And all those services talk together when the forecast is generated. And in the standard customer environment, all of those services should have different accounts that are used to run those services. Here I have given the example that I'll use when I do the demo. So basically in my setup, when I installed AOS and SQL and SSAS with the default settings, I got the network service for the AOS as the user. I got for the SQL, the MS SQL server as the user that is used to run SQL. And I got also the MS SQL OLAP service, which is the user that is used to run SSAS. And if you just install your system, all those different services, they do not have access to each other. So if you run demand forecasting, it will not work because those different users will have no access. So I will show you how to set up the correct permissions for those users, and so you can use it within your company. But how will it look together with the users? So the users that generate the forecast or that adjust the forecast. Where do they fit there? So this is the very simple example. So we have the blue guy, the will planner. And the will planner is the person that is responsible to generate the forecast in the organization. So in order to generate this forecast, he needs to have the access to AX, because this is the place where you go to the form and click Run and generate the forecast. So he needs a specific AX role, which in case of the standard AX is the production planner role. And then this will planner, he also needs the SSAS role. And it is very important to know that the roles within AX and the roles within the SSAS, they're totally different. So you need to set them up separately in order to grant the access to the data that is stored in SSAS. In my setup, I have also the Susan USA, and she is the sales manager responsible for adjusting the forecast, but only for the US region. There are also other managers, for example, for Germany and other countries, and those managers should not see the forecast that gets generated for the other region, and they should not have access to modify the forecast of the other manager. So in this case, Susan will need to have the limited access to the data that is stored in the SSAS. So I'll try to show you now how to set up the security correctly. Yeah. So let's jump to the demo. So in my standard setup, as I told you, we have the will planner, who is the production planner, and he is responsible to generate the forecast. And we have also my account, and I'm the administrator on this computer, and I'll use this account to set up everything. So basically, we have just will planner, and the Susan USA, she even doesn't have an account in AX. She doesn't need to have it. She just needs to have correct role in SSAS in order to modify the forecast. So how to set up the three services that I've been talking about. So this is the management studio of the SQL, and I have connected to the SQL database. And what do we need to set up here? Basically, the analysis services needs to read and write the data from the SQL. So it can get all the historical transactions to the cube. So what do we need to set up here? we'll need in the logins add the user that is used to run analysis services. In my case, it's the MS SQL OLAP service user. And this user needs to have correct permissions. So in the user mappings, he needs to have the access to the AX database. He doesn't need to have the access to the model, only to the data. And what permissions does he need? He needs to access to read the data, write the data, and also what can be a little bit surprising, he needs to have the access to the DDL, to the data definition language. And this is because the analysis services, in order to do the write back, it creates a new tables in the SQL database. So when you generate the forecast, the new tables are created in the SQL. That's why the analysis services needs to have rights to run DDL commands. So this is the basic setup for the SQL. You need to grant the access for the analysis services user and the SQL. Now let's jump to the analysis services that I have connected here. So basically, for the admin users of the analysis services, we need to add in my case, it's network service, but this is the user that is used to run AOS. So AOS is like the main, it runs the main process. So it processes the cubes, it also processes the mining model and then imports the predictions. So basically, AOS needs to have administrative rights on the analysis services. So it is very, very important to set this up. Then we go to the specific databases. Basically, in the demand forecasting, we have two databases. The first is used to generate the accuracy of the forecast, and the second one is just the one to keep the forecast. So all of them, both of them, they are set up totally the same. So I'll just show you how to do it for the forecast database. So in data sources, you will need to find the Dynamics database. And in this Dynamics database, there is one very important setting that by default, when you install analysis services, is set up incorrectly. So basically, the impersonalization info in the security settings needs to be set up to use services account. This means that when user writes the data in Excel, he adjusted the forecast and publishes the changes, the user of the analysis services will be used in order to write the data back into SQL. If you leave it as the default inherit, the user that opened the Excel file will be used to write the data back into the SQL. And this will probably not work. Some of you might be tempted to grant the access to this user that opens Excel to the SQL in order so he can read and write the data, but you shouldn't do that because it would be like a security breach, and this user will have access to modify all the tables in AX. So please remember about the use service account, so to change it in the Dynamics database data source. Okay, so this is like the basic setup for the services, and now let's jump to the roles. The roles are basically used to grant access to the users to the SSAS data to the cubes. So basically, when you deploy demand forecasting, you will have two roles. The first of them will be the production manager, and the second of them is the production planner. And they are basically the same. They have just different names. And all of those roles, they have full access to the data that is stored in the SSIS. And you can see it here. If the role has the full control, this means the user has access to all the data. So in my scenario, we would like to have the will planner, the access to all the data. So in order to achieve that, we'll need to add this will planner as a member of this role. just here. And from now on, the Will Planner will have access to all the data in AX. But how to set up the limited data? For example, for the Susan, who is the manager of the USA region. So in order to achieve that, you will need to add a new role. And now I will show you how to set up this new role in the analysis services. So let's just right-click on roles and add a new role. So yeah, let's call it role USA. So now I'll go through the different check marks and different settings that you need to set up here. I have also attached like the hidden slides in my presentation. So when you download it, you will see the screenshots of of all the steps I have done here, so you can further apply it on your system. So just simply go through that. So in order to set the limited access, you cannot set the full control, as from now, this time the user will have the full access. You just need to set process database and read definition privileges. You need to add the user in the membership. In my case, it's the Susan USA user. So let's add her as a member of this role. Then in the data sources, you of course need to grant the read access. In the cubes, we'll need to grant the read and write access to the demand forecasting cube. We do not need to give the drill through access. It doesn't matter. In the cell data, here you set up the settings per cube. So we basically have one cube here. And what do we need to set up here? We need to enable the read and write permissions for this role. And this is the part that may be a little bit hard to understand, as this is the place where you should put the MDX expression that is run every time when the user modifies the forecast in Excel and he publishes the data. So this expression will be run every time. So the simplest way to set it up is just to put true. So every time the user modifies something, it will return true. So he will have access basically to everything. But this can be further easily limited by the dimension data. So this is the most important place here, where you select to which dimension values the user should have access to. So in my case, I would like to just grant Susan USA access to the USA region. So how do you do that? You just find the dimension that you want to limit the access to. In my case, it's the country region dimension. So I just click OK. And here I will see all the different dimension values that now Susan has access to. But we just want to give her the access to one dimension. So the easiest way to do that is just to click deselect all members. So now she has access to nothing. But then just simply find the USA value and just tick it. So from now on, the Susan will have just access to the USA region. So when she opens the Excel file, she will just see values for this region. So now let's see if this all setup works. So let me jump to the Will Planner, who is the production manager. And this guy is responsible for generating the forecast. So this is AX application, and this user is not an admin. He just has the production planner role. So he has access to generate the statistical baseline forecast. So let's generate the forecast for this user. And yeah, let's generate the forecast. And it's very important to remember that the user that generates the forecast doesn't have to have the access. Doesn't have to have the access even to the SSAS. He can just generate the forecast, and then it can be further edited by other users. He even doesn't need to open the Excel file. So in order to generate the forecast, he just needs to have the correct role in AX, and you need to have the correct setup with the services. But in my case, I have granted the full access for this world planner. So let me open the Excel file, and let's see if the user has full access. Yes, this is true. In my environment, I have two regions. The first of them is Germany, and the second of them is the USA region. And simply here you see the forecast per item, just for the different months. Like it starts from the January 2013 and goes further. So everything is correct. The world planner has the full access to the forecast that he has generated. But then let's go to the Susan. So world planner, he sends the Excel file to Susan, and let's see when Susan opens the Excel file, how will it look like? So let's jump to the Susan. So Susan basically gets the file with the forecast, and she wants to open it and modify the data. So yeah, this is true. Everything is set up correctly. She only can see the data for the USA region. So SSAS basically looked into the credentials of Susan, and it saw that she is the member of the USA role, and it just returned the data for this dimension value. So this is the very simple way that you can limit the access to the data for the different users. And it is important to remember that that the roles within AX and the roles within SSAS are are set it up correctly. So in my environment, the Susan doesn't have any access to AX. She just got the file with the demand forecast. She opened it, and the data was read from SSAS into AX, from the SSAS into Excel. And of course, now she can simply modify the forecast based on her knowledge. And after that, she can simply go to the Analyze, OLAP tools, and just publish the changes. So now the changes, they are simply published into SSAS, and she can notify the world planner that, oh, I'm ready with adjusting my forecast. Now you can import it back into AX. So this is the first demo. Let's get back to the presentation. So I have given you here a small cheat sheet where you can see how to set up the full access to the data for the user and also the limited access. So here you can see all the different parameter values that you need to set into SSAS role to make it work correctly. Okay, the next part is about the functionality extensions. So we heard from many customers that they want to generate the forecast per different forecasting dimensions. And some of those dimensions may even not exist in AX because they might have some custom code with those dimensions. So from the beginning, when we were designing demand forecasting solution, we took this into account and we designed demand forecasting to be extensible. So you can quite easily add the new dimension to the system. And what is also very nice, that adding a new measure, which is like the different set of numbers that you can see together with the forecast that gets generated, can also be added pretty easily. What are the common steps to do that? So basically there are like four common steps. So at the beginning, you need to find the tables, the demand forecasting tables, and simply add the fields into those tables so they can be further filled by the processors. After you add the correct fields, you need to register the new dimension and then activate it in the setup form within the AX. The next step is to make those visible to the user, and here you will need to add. Here you will need to use the standard Dynamics BI stack, and I'll show you how to do that. And the last part will be adding a processor class to populate this data within those new fields that you have added in the first step. So let me do a demo and show you how you can simply add a new forecasting dimension into the existing demand forecasting solution. So let me log back. So we are back into AX Word, and I have opened the development environment. So we'll now jump a little bit to the code, so I can show you how to add a new dimension to the demand forecasting. So basically, you can see the base steps here. So the first one is the modification of the data model. The second one is the modification of the BI elements that are the part of the demand forecasting, and the third one is modification of the code that you need to do. So let's start with the base data model. So basically, there. Hardly readable. I can I change resolution maybe? Is it better? Okay, I'm happy. So getting back to the base data model, we have one enumeration in the demand forecasting that basically keeps all the forecasting attributes. So if you want to add a new dimension, in our case, it's the sales responsible dimension that we'll add. You just simply need to add new value to this enum. And in my case, I have added the sales responsible dimension here. So pretty easy. Add a new attribute type to this enumeration. Second step is modification of the base tables. So basically, in the demand forecasting, we have three base tables. The first one, I've been talking about it in the beginning in the data flow, is the one that is holding the historical transactions. The second one is the one that is used to hold the forecast, the predictions that gets generated from the mining model. And the third one is something special that I haven't talked about. So basically, we have in demand forecasting the functionality to track the changes that the user have made in Excel file. So those changes can be further applied when the user regenerates the forecast in the future, so he doesn't need to go over and over again and do the same changes in Excel. So this table also needs to be modified. But modification is really, really simple. You just need to add a new field here, and that's it. So just add a new field that will hold your new dimension value and all of those three base demand forecasting tables. So here, yeah. The next step is updating the related queries and views. You just need to go through the cross references for those tables, like here, and just find by which queries and views those tables are used, and simply add those fields to those queries and views. It's also very simple. Just drag and drop the fields. So this is basically it, the modification of the base data model. So overall, it's just adding a fields to the couple of tables that will hold your new dimension. The second part, it's a little bit more complicated, but still not hard. You need to add a new view that will hold all the values of the new dimension. So in my case, I have a view that is called demo sales responsible, and it is simply filled by this query. And when the query is run, simply in this table, I have the names of all sales responsible people in the company, and this is basically then read by the SSAS as a dimension values. So simply add a new view holding all the dimension values. The third step. So we need to modify the BA perspective, which is the part of the BA framework. So the BA perspective is the thing, like the metadata definition that is used to generate the cube that is then deployed into the SSAS. So this description of the cube needs to be updated so it knows that we want to add a new dimension. So in order to add the new dimension, you just need to drag and drop the new view that you have created, basically here. So it will appear in the views of the perspective that is used to generate the cube. You need to set up all the labels, and those labels will be visible in Excel for the user. And also in the fields, you should find the field that is holding the dimension values, and also add the label that will be visible in Excel. And a very important thing to remember is the analysis usage. So depending on the type, how you want to use this field, you should either check the attribute, so it will be used as a new forecasting dimension, or as the measure. So if you select this, this will be used as the measure, so it will be visible together with the values of the forecast that gets generated. In my case, I have set it up to be the attribute, so it will be discovered by the BI framework as the attribute. So when this is done, when you have added a new view and put it into the definition of the cube, you will need to update the BI project. So we need to go to the business intelligence tools. So simply go to the tools, then to business intelligence BI tools. And then we need to go to the analysis services wizard. And this wizard have multiple functionalities, but in order to update the cube that have been already deployed into SSAS, you just simply need to check the update mode of this wizard. And then select the project that you want to update. And basically what this wizard will do, it will go into the perspective and check all the differences between this perspective that we have modified and the project that has been deployed into the SSAS, and will simply apply the differences. I'll not go through that to save some time because it takes a couple of minutes to run this, but in the end, when the wizard finishes, you should simply see that the new dimension, in my case it's sales responsible dimension, was added to the cube. And then it will be visible in Excel after this is done. So after you update the project, it is very good practice to check if it was updated correctly. So we also need to use the next part of the BI stack. So the project in this case is called the demand forecast, and we simply, to see it, we'll need to click edit. So now the project will be opened, and it will be stored in the location that is visible in the info log message. So SQL data tools have now been opened. And this is the tool that you can basically use to modify the SSAS project. Basically, here you see the data sources that we have set it up, the cube, and also all the dimensions. And in my case, we see the new dimension, the sales responsible. So after the product was updated, the new dimension was added. The important thing to check here is not this, but the dimension usage. So you simply need to go here to the dimension usage and see if the new dimension has been related to the measure groups. And the most common thing is that it is not related. So I'll now simply show you how to relate it to the measure group. So if you don't see your new dimension, what should you do? You should simply add a new cube dimension here. Select the new dimension that you have added, click OK. And then you will see 3 gray squares. And here you set the relationship between the dimension and the measure groups. In my case, I'm setting the historical data measure, the relation to the historical data measure group. You should use the regular relationship and simply select the dimension that you have added and just relate it. Basically, the fields are the same, so it should be pretty easy to find the correct join between the new dimension and the measure group. You simply click OK, and the value is added here. And you basically need to do it for all 3 measure groups, for the historical data, for the current IX forecast, and for the demand forecast. So after this is done and you have saved your project, you need to import it back into AX. In the Visual Studio projects and Analysis Services projects, you can find our 2 demand forecasting projects. You simply click Import and go to the place that have been printed out here in the info log. So after you imported the project, you need to deploy it. And you go again to the Analysis Services project wizard and simply use the deploy option. And from now on, the new project with the new dimension will be deployed to the SSIS. So this is the part with the BI elements. And now the last part, just quickly go through this. You also need to modify the code. So the first thing you need to modify is the macro, that is like the global macro for the demand forecasting. It's called regdemplan, and it stores all the different constants of the demand forecasting. So I'll now quickly show you where to add those new dimensions. So basically, we have different definitions here. So we have the attributes that are mandatory. In case of demand forecasting, it's data area ID, site, and allocation key. We have some dimensions that are enabled by default when you install demand forecasting. And you have also the dimensions that are configurable. So you can simply enable them and disable them. So it is quite logical that you need to add your new dimension to this macro. What is also important to remember is that you need to add a correct analysis services hierarchy for the dimension that you have added. So simply add it here, put the hierarchy here. It's basically very easy. You just repeat the same thing 3 times in the square brackets, and it will work. You can look into the other examples here. And also you need to give the name of the new dimension here. So this is the modification of the macro. Just add the new dimension value here. And now the last step, you need to add a new data processing class that will fill the staging table that holds the historical data with the new dimension value. So in case of demand forecasting, we have used the SYS extension framework, which is basically the framework that lets you extend the existing functionality without modifying the original code. So if you want to add a new dimension, you should simply write a new processor that will fill up the staging table. And how to do this? You simply create a new class that should extend this staging table processor class that is like the abstract class. And you should also use the same attribute for this. And from now on, the sys extension framework will know that there is a new processor, and it will simply run it when the demand forecasting process is run. You also need to put the description that is visible in the demand forecasting session log within the tasks that were run when you run the baseline forecast. And you also need to implement the execute method. In my case, for the sales responsible, it wasn't so hard. I simply written the query that updates the staging table, the Regdenplan staging table, with the value. I've done a couple of joins and just get the first name and the second name of this sales responsible person, and just simply filled the staging table with the values. What is quite important to do is also to check if the attribute is enabled. So you do not want to run those queries if the attribute is not enabled, because you will simply lose the time and it will not be visible in Excel. So simply you need to take the attribute manager and check if your new dimension have been enabled. And if it was enabled, you run the query and the staging table is filled. So now let's see if this whole thing works. Let's go to the demand forecasting, and in the demand forecasting parameters, let's see if we see our new dimension. So let's go to the forecasting dimensions, and yes, we see the new sales responsible dimension. And if you want to forecast by this dimension, you click here, and the dimension simply jumps to the dimensions that are enabled. So I have enabled the new dimension. And now let's generate the forecast using this new dimension. So in this process, as I have told you, the new processor that we have implemented will be run after the staging table is filled from the invent trans and invent trans origin tables. And the new dimension column that we have added, the new fields, will be filled with the values of the sales responsible. And then it will go to the cube, and it will be visible in the Excel file. So forecast is generated. Let's open the Excel file and see if we have the sales responsible dimension that haven't been before in the basic demand forecasting solution. Yeah, let's try again. This happens sometime. Okay, so we see our forecast, and do we see a new dimension? Let's check here. Yeah, we see the new sales responsible dimension. So instead of the country region that we have used in the previous demo, we see the sales responsible dimension, which is the totally new dimension that haven't been before in the system. So if you go through those steps with your dimensions, with your custom dimensions, you can add them to the Excel file and generate forecasts per different forecasting dimensions. So this was the demo. Again, I have added a cheat sheet where you can see all the tables that you need to modify, all the enums and macros that needs to be modified, and the cubes that are used in the forecasting process. Data source extension. The last part of this presentation is about how to load the data from the external systems into the IX 2012 Earth-3. It's commonly known that most of you are not using the 2012 Earth-3, and you have all your historical data in the other systems. And this part will cover how to load this data. And trust me, it's quite easy. I'll show you how to do that. So we have imagined two ways of loading the historical data into R3 system. So the first of them is the bulk transfer, and we imagine that as the one-time operation. You write a query that will load the data from the external system and put it into this staging table that holds all the historical data. The simplest way to do it is to write a job in the AX, into the 2012 AX, that will pull the data from the external system and just writes it back to the staging table. The reason of that is that the system sequences will be synced correctly if you do it like that. So the rec IDs assignments will be correct if you run this process in the 2012 R3 system. The advantage of that is that after you do this bulk transfer, the source system can be turned off. It can be totally decommissioned. You have all your historical data in the 2012 system and this historical staging table. And then you just need a small amount of code to put it into the forecasting process. The next option is the selective transfer. It's like the live update of the system. It works like that. So when the forecasting process is run, there is a piece of code run that reads the data from the external system and puts it into the staging table. What you need to remember, it's quite obvious that the source system needs to be always available when the demand forecasting process is run. But the advantage of that is that you load only the amount of data that is needed. In the bulk transfer, you probably should load all the data from the external system. In this case, you can just load the data that you need for the given period. There is also another option. You can combine the selective transfer with the bulk transfer. So load the data in the beginning, and then when the time goes by and the external system is still on, it's still working, and the transactions are added, the selective transfer is run, so it runs it loads just the difference between the data that you have loaded in the beginning and the data that have changed. Some constraints. So you need to have the master data matched and also the unit of measure matched between those two systems. So if you load product A, the AX 2012 needs to know what product A is. Also, the unit of measure needs to match. And also here I have underlined the fields that are mandatory in this staging table that is holding the historical transactions. So you need to fill those, and other of them, they are not mandatory. You do not need to fill them if you do not need to use those forecasting dimensions. So if you don't need the customer and customer group, you don't need to fill it if this customer dimension is not enabled. I'll do a quick demo of how to load the data from Dynamics AX 2009. In my case, it's holding the sales history from the past, and we would like to use this sales history in 2012 R3 in order to generate the demand forecast. So I'll show you the code that will do it. So this is much easier than adding a new dimension. You simply need to write a new class that is also using this sys extension framework. So in this case, you will need to implement the staging table filler. Previously, we have implemented the processor. Now we're implementing the filler that fills the data into the historical staging table. You also need to implement the attribute. It's the same with the description. Just put description that means something to you. So it will be visible in the session log here in the tasks. And the code. So I'll remove the comments that I have added before. So this code was not run, but now it will be run. So in my case, I have the AX 2009 database in my system, so you can see it here in the databases. I have the database with all sales transactions from AX 2009. So how to load the data? You just run the query. It will be custom based on the system that you're loading data from. So this is the one that worked with 2009. So you simply write the query that loads the data from the external system. Then you run it against your database. In my case, I have the database on the local host that is called Dynamics AX 2009. And then when you have your data loaded, you iterate through this data and fill the staging table. So all the fields are filled based on the data that you loaded from the external system, and it is added to record insert list that is further inserted into the database. The good thing to do is to use this record insert list, as it can improve the performance of the whole load. So it's nice to use. So this is it. Let's see if the data is loaded correctly. So let me run the forecasting process for the last time. And in this case, the new filler that we have written will be run during this process, and the data should be loaded from AX 2009, and the forecast should be generated based on this external data. So let's wait a little bit and see if the data has been loaded correctly from the external system. So let's open the Excel file and see and check if there are any differences between the forecast that we saw before. Again, it doesn't want to open it. Oh, OK. So we have the new data. You see, we got a new sales responsible person. So the transactions, the historical transactions that you can see by using this forecasting measure, you can see that we have loaded those transactions from the AX 2009, and based on the values that we have loaded, we have new forecast generated. So now we have data both from AX 2012 and AX 2009. So this is it. I have also added a cheat sheet. So here you can see which classes do you need to implement in order to use the SYS extension framework that we have used in demand forecasting to fill the historical data and also to enrich the data. So you need to use the filler and the processor. And it's worth mentioning that if you want to modify the accuracy process, you should use the same classes. It's using the same classes to do it. So that's it. Now it's time for questions if you have any, and I would really appreciate the feedback for this session. Yeah, can you go to the microphone so it can be recorded? Thank you.
So I had a quick question regarding the demand forecast parameter setup. You've gone through permissions on the cube side, permissions from the AX roles, SSIS roles, and so on. One of the things that we're just now kind of experimenting with the demand forecasting piece, and we're finding that on the demand forecasting parameter setup page, choosing the cubes looks like it requires a sysadmin role rather than the production manager role. And we're wondering basically if you knew explicitly what roles were required for making changes on that demand forecasting parameter page.
So I do not remember it by heart, but there is an additional role that you need to add to the user. And if you add this role, he will be able to to modify the session log because the production planner cannot do it, and he will be able to set up the cubes. Roxana, if you remember that. But there is a separate user that is used to set up the system. I'll try to find it after the questions. I'll show you.
Okay. And then the other piece was in regards to what they're actually updating with Excel, going back to the cube. The users are not able to actually modify any of the transactional data, correct? When I'm thinking of cubes when I worked on other systems, those are read-only, therefore reporting information only. They're not actually updating anything. But yet in the diagram, I saw what looked like a write-back going from Excel back to the cube.
That is true. So the user can modify, if I jump back to this, the user cannot modify the historical transactions. So he cannot modify invent trans records or anything like that. He can just modify the forecast that gets generated from the cubes. So the dimension that is called forecasted quantity can be modified. And this data is written back to SSIS. So this thing you can modify. But the historical data is not modifiable. Yeah, you get the error. We couldn't modify this. The write-back doesn't work. So this is not possible for the historical data. For the forecast that gets generated, it's possible because it's like the core scenario that the users look into the forecast that get generated and adjust them based on their knowledge of the business knowledge they have.
Forgive me, this might be more for Roxana. The item all the items in an item allocation key, do they need to have the same unit of measure? Okay.
So we have the one unit of measure per demand forecasting that is set up here. So it's not set up by item allocation key. And all the transactions are converted into this unit of measure.
Hi.
That's great. Yeah. What I found is the supply schedule. The supply schedule does not do that. If you're looking at an item allocation key in the supply schedule with the time buckets, if you've got two items in there with different units of measure, it just adds them up regardless. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So how do I include an item that has no history in my forecast?
That has no history.
Brand
in
new
your
item.
forecast.
We're introducing it. We need to forecast it.
Yeah, you basically cannot do that in Excel, I think. Oh. And it gets zeros. Yeah, it gets zeros. We have implemented that
Okay.
as a feature. I remember that. Yeah.
Secondly, the dates you had monthly buckets.
Yeah.
Do you have the ability to make those based on a fiscal calendar?
Not in the current version. No, we just have the day, week, and month.
So
But
they're
maybe in the
based on
future.
just calendar dates.
It's just based on that.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
Do you have any plans on adding amounts? Usually,
Amounts, like-
pieces are good, but money is better.
I think we should ask Roxana, our PM.
Okay.
Yes, so the answer is, yeah, we didn't have time to do it, but it's in our backlog.
Yes. That's why I'm asking. Second question. When you add a new measure, would it also be possible to update that via Excel?
If
Like
you
is
enable
Webam-
the write back for this measure, yes, it would be. But it requires some additional work in SSIS.
Or would it
to
make
that.
sense to have something different from the forecast value to write back to the item allocation key for getting updated? I guess not.
I don't think so. We haven't heard about customers requiring that. They just wanted to see values, just read only values together with the forecast.
Okay. Final question. When you have Excel, are you allowing to change the total and then it would split the values
Yes.
into?
Yeah, you can do that. I can show you this. So I mean, modify the totals and split it within the items. So
Yeah, so if you add 1,000, it should split based upon the values that's currently in there.
yeah, it just
Fantastic.
splitted it based on the values that it had before.
Okay.
It
Thanks.
got like the weighted values. It's not rounding up.
It's an Excel feature. You just
Yeah, you can just simply do it like that. But when those values are imported back into AX, they will be rounded up. Yes, but not in Excel. Yeah, you can do this in Excel. Okay, so I think that's it. Thank you very much for joining this session.